think we can get started. Matthew, could you just have the next slide, please? Okay, well, we go back to my pretty picture. That'll be great. Thanks. Yeah, so welcome everybody to this year's Coffee Science Seminar Series. My name is Craig Hardner. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Science, and I'm also chair of the Coffee Science Seminar Committee. And this year, my vision is to again build our seminar series as a vehicle to showcase our science and impact both internally and externally to current and future stakeholders. Next one, Matthew. I'd like to acknowledge country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet and are presenting from today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society. Next one, thanks. Okay, so most of you attending will probably know that the seminar is scheduled from 12 to 1 today. And after the presentation, Matthew's going to finish about 1:45, he intends, so that we've got opportunities for questions and answers. So if you'd like to ask Matthew a question, there's a Q&A tab down the bottom that I'll be monitoring and collating the questions from at the end. Next one, please, Matthew. So now I'd like to thank Matthew and introduce Matthew for opening the batting for this year's Coffee Science Seminars. Matthew joined Coffee just over 12 months ago from Erie, where he was CEO for 5 years and research director for 2 years prior to that. Prior to joining Erie, Matthew worked at CSIRO, where he led a research program in future grains and plant oil production. Matthew's main research area when he was at the bench was grain quality and cereal genetics. Today, Professor Morell will give his perspectives of coffee's contribution to UQ's vision in the agri-food and bioeconomy. I'll leave it to you, Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Craig. And great pleasure to be opening the batting again, Craig. I hope it's not a sticky wicket. But it is, I think, timely to have this conversation again. So Coffee's been through a very dynamic period of growth since its inception about 11 years ago. We have been through several quite searching reviews of Coffee, and now I've had a year here in order to start to initiate some of the things that I'd like to see embedded in Coffee as we move forward to prepare Coffee really for the next decade of growth. But of course, it's much bigger than Coffee. It's also about our intimate relationship with broader UQ, our relationship with DAF, and also, I'm sorry, I'm just not quite sure why you can't see me. Is that it? Right. And our other partners into the future. So a really good time to take stock and talk about some of the directions that we see for the future. So we'll now go into the slides. All right, so.
Sorry, Matthew, I can't quite. Oh, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you.
All right, you got them now? Okay.
Wonderful.
All right. Okay. All right. So before I start, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. So we're all aware that we live in quite vexed times in some regards. We continue to face the inexorable pressures of population growth. And while I don't see this issue discussed quite as openly as some of the other issues that face us at the current time. So many of the pressures that we're going to face in agriculture and food are driven by or compounded by this inexorable growth in population. And as these projections show, it's really 40 or 50 years time before we're likely to hit peak population. We also have the pressures that we're all aware of with greenhouse gas emissions, with the inexorable rise of carbon dioxide levels, but other greenhouse gas issues coming from denitrification, etc., methane production. These forces are really shaping the agriculture and food environment in which we're operating. We're also facing some very polarized demographic challenges. So on this slide, just showing that in the dark green areas here of the world, we're really confronting the fact that we're going to be a very aging population with very particular needs in terms of nutrition and food, but also different structure of our workforce and our education systems. Yet in the light green, we have areas of the world where there's a very different dynamic, where the majority of the population is in fact less than 25. And so a completely different set of needs. So this bifurcation of the issues facing the world, I think, is tremendously important. Coming a little closer to home, just to touch on the way in which we're seeing the next 4 or 5 years in QAAFI and in the university. So in the late last year, the university completed its strategic planning initiative, and there were a number of areas identified where we'd be focusing in the future, of course, on the learning and our student experience as one of Australia's premier universities, on our research and innovation capacity and strength. And of course, I'll be talking about this more as I go through the talk, but also as a frontline objective, enriching our community. So how do we engage with industry, with community, with government to be a more effective contributor, but also a shaper of the future? The university also sees a number of enablers. So our global profile, our people, and the ways in which we secure our future in terms of partnerships, funding, etc. Now, in that context, QAAFI also went through a strategic planning exercise, and I certainly don't expect anybody to be reading this entire slide, but we have been very assiduously looking at the issues that are shaping our future. I'm going to touch on a number of these areas in the remainder of the presentation, particularly the development of our strategic themes, our relationship with our partners, our relationship with the university and with DAF. So to remind everybody in QAAFI knows this, but for those of you in our broader audience today, QAAFI is a unique entity. So it is a University of Queensland institute established under that framework, but it's also a partnership with the Queensland government via the Department of Agriculture and Food, and was built from bringing together former DAF staff with UQ staff. And we operate across both UQ and DAF sites. So this gives us a unique flavour and a unique opportunity to engage with government and industry. And so in that sense, just to point out a number of the strategic objectives that DAF is focusing on in food and fibre, that QAAFI aligns with. So around driving growth, efficiency, sustainability, supporting the development of a modern and skilled workforce, advancing research and development. We are less involved in, but contribute to improving Queensland's biosecurity capability and delivering service innovation. So in our engagement with DAF, there are a number of areas where QAAFI is particularly engaged with the agenda of the Queensland government. So I've illustrated here around improved genetics and varieties, around production system innovation, in horticulture and physiology and agronomy, and transforming production systems. And finally, and I think very importantly, value adding into supply chains and markets. Because of this association, we also have to consider in what we do the benefit to Queensland. And so our alliance is expected to consider measurable impact, developing scientific capacity, new generation of agri-food scientists, and enhancing Queensland's reputation as a powerhouse in agriculture and food. And of course, UQ's overall ranking as number 2 in agriculture globally, according to the NTU rankings, points to that established relationship. But as QAAFI is part of the University of Queensland, we also have to consider the global development imperative. So this map, a little different to our traditional map, but based on population size rather than geographic area. And of course, we're quite a small feature in the bottom right hand of this graph. And it just shows that our nearest neighbours in our region, tremendous population challenges. We know that Australia feeds somewhere of the order of 120 million people every year, despite our own population being 25 million or so. So we have a tremendous influence, both in terms of the products that we produce, but also, I would argue, the science that we do. And we have, I think, a moral imperative to continue to be engaging with those less fortunate than ourselves in the region and globally. So to the QAAFI agenda, I think many of you are familiar that we have 4 areas of very established scientific depth around crop science, around animal science, horticultural science, and nutrition and food sciences. And I'm pleased to say that 2021 really had some very important highlights for us. So we have, as I mentioned, the UQ and DAF reviews, implemented many of the outcomes of those reviews, and I've talked about the strategic planning exercises. We're also successful in attracting significant additional funding for the next few years from the research support package from the federal government, but also the Vice-Chancellor's strategic funding. So this led us to a very strong income performance, and indeed we generated a small surplus. We also began the process of recruiting and onboarding new key talent. So Professors Michael Edvardi, Damien Hine have enriched our senior leadership, but of course many other recruitments, particularly through the RSP process, have enriched our scientific capacity. We've also engaged on what we call a reset process with DAF to ensure that we are operating in close harmony in terms of our strategy, our operations, but also the way in which we work together. And finally, we had a very strong publication performance and staff recognition. So I do want to reflect on a lesson that I think I learned a number of years ago. And it was about the way in which we frame questions and seek answers in science. And the lesson came from the then chair of the CSIRO board. Craig mentioned that I was in CSIRO at that time, and it was Catherine Livingston. And Catherine is very well known for her senior governance role on a number of boards. And the message that she gave us was that we shouldn't be looking, we should be looking for the second best answer to the problem. And of course, the secret to this is in the punctuation. It's not that we're looking for an inferior answer, but we're looking past the first answer that occurs to us to see a deeper and more comprehensive solution to a question. So I want to give an example from agriculture and to set up the remainder of the discussion today. So when we think about yields, the first best answer, which is probably the basis of the Green Revolution, which was to produce more grain to abolish famine. And yes, globally, we were very successful in that endeavour. But it didn't necessarily improve the lot of farmers, particularly smallholder farmers. So perhaps a second best answer was to increase productivity and profitability to increase incomes. But as we took this discussion further, we realised that having a very narrow range of crops and a very yield-focused orientation meant that we needed to seek a further best answer, and that has been to increase nutrition to improve health. But I think in this, we're now very much in a fourth best answer era, and that is to not only produce the grain to abolish famines, increase the lot of the farmer, increase the health of the consumer, but also to reduce greenhouse gases and environmental footprint. So I think it's this richness in the questions that we're thinking about and the nature of the joined up answers that we need to be delivering that will characterise the next 10 years of agriculture and food. Globally, but of course for QAAFI and UQ. So I want to illustrate how we're addressing some of the major challenges in QAAFI. And I've already mentioned our four key engines of science, our centres led by Ben Hayes, by Ian Godwin, by Nina Mitter and Mike Gidley. But in the last year, we've been developing the concept of cross-cutting themes as a key enabling mechanism to position our research better, to answer big questions, to partner more effectively and engage in UQ's aspiration and ambition around enriching communities. So why are we introducing these themes? Well, the imperative that I see is to really focus our thinking not on technical solutions alone, but to address the big questions of our era. To enhance, not that it wasn't there before, but to enhance our capacity to engage in multidisciplinary collaboration across domains, not just technical domains, but increasingly, I think we need to see the solutions as requiring economic, social, systems level thinking in order to have the impact that we're aspiring to. We're looking to pull together teams with critical capacities and critical mass, and as a mechanism for developing essential research, funding, and delivery partnerships. So while these are QAAFI themes, we certainly expect, and so far they have, strongly resonated with our partner agencies, our partners across UQ, so that we are able to amplify the benefit and criticality of the work that we're doing. And finally, we're looking to seek resourcing at scale with our partners for the future. So our 4 thematic areas around agribusiness, value chains, and the bioeconomy, so led by Damien Hine; predictive agriculture, led by Lee Hickey; sustainable agri-food systems, Barbara George Jagley; and healthy agriculture and food for healthy communities, Yasmina Sultanbawa and Femi Akinsami. And I'll just give a bit of a flavour of each of these themes without seeking to define their entire agenda. And I will illustrate ongoing QAAFI activities that feed into these thematic areas. If you're in QAAFI and your area is not mentioned, please, it's not intended to be an encyclopedia of everything that we're doing. So firstly, the agribusiness thing. And this is a reasonably new area for QAAFI. And I want to pick up the fact that there are, as I'm sure anybody who reads the papers understands, significant pressures on universities at the current time around research commercialisation performance. There is a view that not enough university research finds its ways into the hands of those who need to use the research. That perhaps that universities are not focusing their research agenda explicitly enough on the needs of our partners. So the federal government recently released an additional research commercialisation package that talks about at-scale investments, focused priorities, leadership from industry, stronger collaboration with industry, and what they're calling engaged research institutions. So in this agribusiness theme, we will be closely working to understand how future government policy is going to shape us, but equally how the universities might shape that government policy into the future. In working with industry, I think this is an exciting time for UQ and for QAAFI and our partners. There is a very vibrant development of a Queensland Agri-Food Innovation Corridor extending from Brisbane in the east through established institutional settings such as Cooper's Plains, through our Gatton farm, Toowoomba, and then to the rest of the state. So through our agribusiness theme, we're engaging very strongly with Agri-Food Connect and other entities in the corridor to see how we build a new ecosystem where we can work together to identify and solve problems and develop people for the future. And then finally, rethinking the bioeconomy. So Damien and other colleagues from business have a very strong suite of tools around understanding the potential of particular innovations, the ways in which they should be brought to market, how they can be better adopted. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity to rethink how we build new economic opportunity for the future with high-value crops, with protected cropping, but not just in these domains, in our other industry sectors as well. Predictive agriculture, an area that will be led by Lee Hickey, and we already have a great strength at UQ in this area. But there's more that we can do. We have expertise in predicting the performance of progeny, of how to better manage crops and livestock systems, in how to predict and manage disease and pest incidents. We have work that we can strengthen in how to predict and value quality of our product, how we can predict market conditions and use that to inform the choices that farmers and producers use. Similarly, with climatic conditions, we have real strength in predicting crop yields, and we have the opportunity to predict the nutritional outcomes from the consumption of the products that we're enabling to be produced better. So a few examples. So the work of Andres and his team. In this case, the sorghum yield prediction report that he produces regularly. So showing that this is indeed an excellent year on the right-hand side, with the blue areas in particular indicating very strong performance. So really important information for not only our farmers, but our supply chain partners and the feed grain industry. At a more basic end, tremendous strength within QAAFI and across UQ with our partners in improving our ability to predict the performance and improve the performance of plants. So the outstanding capacity that Christine and Mark Cooper lead. So really a completely groundbreaking set of capacities to understand our prediction of plant performance into the future. But it's not just all about plants. Ben and his team in our Centre for Animal Science applying, again, fantastic capacity and novel tools to be able to genotype across very distributed herds of animals using novel techniques such as our crush side diagnostics and sequencing capacity, powerful genetics to improve productivity, profitability into the future. In the sustainability area, again, an area that we are engaged in, but from the nature of the challenges that are outlined at the beginning of this talk, so much more to be done and so much more to be thought about in sustainable agri-food systems area. So the work that Daniel and his team are doing in farming systems, particularly in far north Queensland. We have, as if we perhaps didn't need it, but we have the imperative and the urgency brought to us by the IPCC reports around the critical challenges facing us. But I think we also have an imperative to really rethink how agriculture engages with the landscape, with questions such as biodiversity into the future. So I mentioned Daniel's work and his team in far north Queensland. I think what is particularly, encouraging and interesting in terms of this program is that it's not just about researchers doing work which they hope will be applied, but it's about the close integration of the research with farmer-managed trials so that we can directly test the fruits of the research with the farmers in the environment in which this research is going to be adopted. So I think this is a very important direction for us into the future, that co-design, co-location, and co-commitment to adoption. I'd like to just highlight that we have been investing for the future. So brought in Michael Udvardi to really lead what we're doing in pulse genomics. So the area of alternative protein sources, the potential that pulses have and legumes to be really helping with our farming systems and the enrichment of soils, the decrease in dependence on added nitrogen fixation. So using the genome to phenome prediction tool, so a strong overlap with the predictive breeding or predictive agriculture theme, to be developing new opportunities for our farmers, for our systems into the future. Finally, we've been working closely with DAF on a zero net emissions grand challenge for agriculture. So this has really kicked off in the latter part of last year. We've done a lot of scanning of work that's going on in UQ in Australia, and looking at a whole series of opportunities. And I think the important part here are not just technical opportunities to create new technologies that on their own will reduce emissions, but to think about those adjacent policy and societal issues that also need to be addressed in order to create the change that will improve our net emissions performance as an agricultural system. So stay tuned, more to go in this area. The final theme area, healthy agriculture and food for healthy communities. So this is intentionally a broad smorgasbord of research. And so Yasmina and Femi have been collaborating to bring this area together. And the ambition has been to work from the farming system, also through issues in the supply chain, through to the consumer and diet issues. So, of course, not all issues transverse all three domains, but there are many of the important questions that we're looking at that do indeed touch on each of these areas. So, first example, building on a strength in QAAFI already, so bioclay. And I think the extraordinary experience that we've had through COVID reminds us that the RNA technologies have an extraordinary place to play in the future in vaccines, but also in the agricultural system, in plants and animals, to replace and to decrease our dependence on the traditional chemistries. So how we can enlist this technology as a very precise, green, sustainable, renewable technology with very limited potential for any residue issues coming through the food system. So again, an area of very active research, and I think for UQ and for Australia, a very important area to be having sovereign capacity. I'll give an example here that Femi has given to really look at new opportunities for biological approaches to manage diseases, in this occasion in our grain crops. So our horticultural expert working across our commodities, to look at opportunities which are demanded by our customers and our consumers to produce grain that is residue-free and has the certainty of healthy outcomes for the future. But going further, perhaps a more vexed area in terms of how we take this agenda further and how we have impact. But when we look at our Australian diet, we are not linking agriculture and perhaps health outcomes in an effective enough manner. And I just take this example, which shows you the consumption of what we might call discretionary food. And so each of those numbers there in the under males and females indicates a number of serves of food that an average Australian in that age group is consuming. And for males, that's about 7 serves with about 150 calories, about 600 kilojoules, if you think in that way, which is about a half of your daily intake, recommended daily intake. So we are still a nation facing a significant health challenge in terms of food consumption. And in the next slide, the details are not important, but where does this come from? Very little of it comes from fruit and vegetables, a lot from soft drinks, from biscuits, from cakes, processed meats, chocolates, and in red there, alcoholic beverages. So we have a long way to go to achieve the healthy diet recommended to us by our nutritionists. And of course, this feeds into our global nutrition paradox, where at the apex of this triangle here, we have too many people globally overweight, yet we still have far too many people severely food insecure, nearly 700 million each year, and nearly 2 billion moderately insecure. And in terms of nutrient density, we still have well over 2 billion people not having access to a nutritious diet. So going back to that international development imperative, we still have a long way to go, and our food systems have not comprehensively or significantly addressed these questions. So for QAAFI into the next decade, I'll just go through a few issues quickly around staff, infrastructure and resources. So here's a map of our academic staff by levels. I just want to make a couple of quick points. So firstly, yes, we have been investing in senior leadership, but we've also seen the number of level A academics, our postdocs, increasing at an even higher rate. Where we have been less successful is in transitioning people through an effective career structure to develop capacity for the future. So we will be talking a lot more about this question and potential solutions into the future. But I do want to make the point that we do need to put more emphasis on this question and find solutions into the future. It's an intersection of our funding model, our industrial relations framework, and our decision-making around our use of resources. We do have a number of senior recruitments in progress, so watch out for these coming through. We have the retirement of Professor Mike Gidley towards the end of this year, so we are beginning a search for a new Centre Director for our Nutrition and Food Sciences Centre. Steve Williams is moving on, so we're looking for a Deputy Director of Operations. We have just recruited a Professor in Protected Cropping, whose appointment will be announced shortly. And we're currently recruiting for professors in animal biotechnology and sustainable agriculture. And I'm very pleased to say that in partnership with DAF, we're also recruiting an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander liaison officer to enhance our engagement with communities and the way in which we are able to learn from our Indigenous partners, but also to deliver benefits with them for the future. I'll just touch on significant infrastructure development. So the plant growth facility is a wonderful investment that is coming through, that's been not only approved by our Senate, but those close to the construction site know is actively being built now. And that will be a wonderful resource for us in the future in terms of very defined capacity to control growth conditions and to conduct very precise experimentation. We have also had, through the research support package that I mentioned earlier, investments in controlled environment glasshouses to serve both our horticultural and grains crop needs at Gatton into the future, and an investment in what we call the DigiField phenotyping platform in partnership with Scott Chapman and SAFs also at Gatton. And we have a very strong discussion with the Australian Plant Phenomics facility around bringing that national facility to include us here in Queensland into the future. In terms of mundane questions such as revenue, I mentioned that QAAFI has had a very strong performance over the years. For over its first 11 years of operation, we have benefited, as I mentioned, from the research support package that came in after COVID from the federal government. That will phase out at the end of this year. And then we have in our planning very much the ambition to continue to grow and to continue to be able to address new challenges. So in support of that ambition, we did see Bronwyn Venus leave as Research Partnerships Manager at the beginning of this year. Very pleased that we've been able to recruit as Business Development Manager Oliver Frith, and Oliver's just commenced, and also as Commercial Manager Tanashi Chirugwi, who is also now very much on the case. So for those of you in QAAFI, please welcome them and engage with them as they take up their duties. But for our external partners on this seminar, I expect you'll be seeing a lot of Oliver and Tanashi into the future as we develop further research partnerships. So I haven't really mentioned COVID, but it has been a salutary lesson to us all, I'm sure, in not taking the future for granted. And I was reflecting the other day on the sense of complacency that the world had around food supply, food security before COVID came along. And indeed, it was very difficult when I was in international research for development to attract funding to support food security goals. The attitude of the international community was that that solved and there are other questions that are more important. But I was moved to reflect and to revisit this report, which was released by Lloyd's of London in 2015. And in many ways, it was a very prescient report because it talked about the fact that our food systems, while being superficially secure, were in fact vulnerable to shock, and that shock was particularly acute if there were combinations of threats. So while they weren't quite Nostradamus in predicting the pandemic, they did talk about scenarios such as a combination of conflict, of war, of plant diseases, and drought, and the effects that would have on food prices. So I think we as a society, as food systems, need to be revisiting our understanding of resilience, and clearly governments are doing this as we speak, and a lot more discussion about sovereignty and the ability to ensure that we can indeed feed our own people, feed them nutritionally, and indeed feed our neighbours as an overriding moral imperative, but also a security imperative for the future. So I think we have hopefully learnt that lesson, but let's see that translate into support for our research for the future. So in conclusion, I would like to just point to the fact that we do face these very major challenges as a community. As part of that, agriculture and food systems must change. We must invest in sustainable systems, not just systems where we take what we need and don't consider the consequences. I think these larger questions mean that the research that we do is critical, but we do need to rethink the way we do our science. And while I'm not going to pretend that QAAFI can solve it all, our themes do help us to align to our partners, to the big questions. So I will repeat a statement that I've made before, particularly directed at our current and prospective students. There's never been a more important time to be an agricultural scientist. So on that note, I just want to give a plug for our TropAg conference at the end of the year, incorporating the Harlan conference, a very significant opportunity for us to engage with our partners, to talk about the research for the future, and to chart a course going forward. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back to you, Craig.
Sure, Matthew, thank you. Yeah, it's always good to open the year from the director to give us a vision for where we may be moving towards. So I've got a couple of questions that are in the Q&A, and certainly we have got some time to ask questions, and I'd really encourage anybody to put questions up that they feel is valuable to answer in the context of this strategic vision area we're talking about. So I'll start with a question from John Dixon, and he thanks you for encouraging vision and strategy, and asks, to complement the commercialisation of science outputs, how will QAAFI improve the linkages, dialogues between science and state and federal policies? So between our science, I guess, and state and federal policies.
Yeah, thank you, John. As always, a good question. So, I think one of the advantages I pointed to, I think, around QAAFI is that relationship that we do have with the state government, and the ability to feed outcomes from our research, but also the thinking around the policy or the enabling environment, and how policies can change or can be changed for better outcomes in at that level. And this is one reason why we have established that agribusiness theme, is to be much more engaged with our colleagues in economics and in thinking about the policy environment. We also have the opportunity to influence at the federal level, and we continue to seek ways to do that. But I also think, and you've been heavily involved in the international development arena, I do think we also have a very important part to play with partners such as the CGIAR, with the World Bank, with DFAT, in the setting of policies at a more global and regional level. So, I think it is tremendously important that we're not just on the technical side, but we're also thinking about that enabling environment.
And I'll sort of explore that a little bit and follow up, as how may that sort of or filter down through QAAFI? I mean, I imagine, those discussions are going at the higher management level, but, obviously designing our science around those, that improved engagement is useful for all of us at QAAFI. So I guess the question is, how is that going to be communicated throughout QAAFI?
Yeah, so one of the intents, I guess, of having the cross-cutting theme structure, Craig, was to have mechanisms and forums for discussing issues that touch across a number of technical areas, or, a lot of what we're doing in disease resistance in horticultural crops and in grain crops. There's a lot of commonality of questions that would lead to thinking about how that science is adopted. What are the policy questions that impinge on such an area? So, I think the way in which the themes, and I know the theme leaders will be operating, is to encourage that conversation, but also through our existing centre lines of communication. So, I'm hoping that we will, through the influence of people such as Damien Hine and colleagues, is really think about those adoption questions, those policy questions, not as an afterthought after we do the work, but in conceiving the projects for the future. And that will also, in some instances, influence how we seek funding. So there's a real circularity to building this thinking into our research planning for the future.
Sure. Okay, there's a couple of questions about human resources. And the first one, or perhaps I'll start lower and then work higher. What has been the impact of the last 2 years on our postdoc recruitment, especially those and research students, especially those joining from overseas, from a high level perspective?
Yeah, well, clearly we've had the limitations on human movement, right, on people being able to come into Australia. We've had significant limitations on people's relocation within Australia. So, yes, of course, it's had an impact. In our last round of enrolments, we did do pretty well. I think we had 11 new students recently. There are new scholarship rounds opening up. Unfortunately, I don't think they're going to be able to soak up all of the, perhaps if you like, built up, pent up demand, right? But we are able to move forward now that we have certainty around people being able to come into.
Matthew dropped out there. I just wonder if he's going to come back or maybe not. Was that because it was 1 o'clock? Megan, you got anything to say?
No, I think it must be his internet.
Maybe it is. Well, let's see. You can't. Oh, he's dropping out. He may come back. We'll just see how we go there. I mean, yep. Here we go. Okay. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah. You back? Can you hear us, Matthew? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
I don't know what happened there. Did you miss me for a little while?
Yeah.
Probably wasn't.
Tried to fill in. Yeah. So, so the next question about human resources, and perhaps I'm interested in a wider perspective of, you talked about, we talked about the professorial appointments. There's an interest in what about appointing at lower levels than professorial? But I guess the interest is, what is the basis of the strategy for trying to change the current environment for early and mid-career researchers within QAAFI, that, the sort of quite dog-eat-dog, unstable career path that I've got. I mean, that's the Australian university sector, but I guess it'd be interesting to hear what your initial ideas may be.
Yeah, so there's a tension, I think, Craig, that we have between, the way in which research funds are gathered, and particularly from some of our sources, such as the ARC, is very much around the track record and the CV of a principal researcher, right? So we need to be continuing to be strong, and some of the investments at the professorial level are intended to help us with the leadership to build up some of those areas. But I also take the point that we need to be bringing people through with the capacity to act as chief investigators and build their career. And that means having some funded time and opportunity to be able to take on those roles. That means that we need to rethink somewhat our financial model, and also the way in which we structure our grants into the future. That's not something we can change overnight, but it is something that we can progressively influence. We are working hard on how we can do that within our financial capability at the moment. I'll have more to say on it in the future. Okay,
thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So there's a comment here actually from Sarah Holt Moore, of a comment that she works at the Department of State Development, Infrastructure and Local Government, and was seeing and planning and looking at the opportunity to engage with QAAFI. So there may be engagement already happening in that space, but just to provide that feedback.
Yeah, so by all means, shoot us an email and we can set up a discussion. I mean, we have, through that Agrifood Innovation Corridor, for example, a real commitment, I think, from UQ, but also QAAFI is a main partner in that, to be looking at development of infrastructure, but also, engagement with industry that can progress the economic and social objectives of the government. So, very, very interested in following up on opportunities.
Perhaps I can ask the last question, or I've tried to put my flavour on something else. Have we got a strategy of trying to connect with climate scientists? We had a one-day meeting at the end of last year in Sarah Court Science, and there was a lot of feedback about wanting to connect with people that could help scientists put their research in the context of climate science. And we've got strong groups in predictive agriculture and that predictive space, but I guess I'm just thinking more of a how do we build that connection?
Yeah, and so this is an area where we really do need that connectivity. I agree with that. There are established vehicles in Australia for a lot of the climate modelling. CSIRO has been taking a prominent role. So I think our role is definitely not to reinvent some of those initiatives, but is to find ways in which we're engaging in the context of the agricultural systems that we're working in, right? So we are able to understand more about the accounting practices in greenhouse gases. What would a technology that we're developing really meaningfully contribute to that opportunity? How would you need to, on what scale would you need to adopt that technology for the future? So this is very much a part of the Zero Net Challenge area that I talked about. Damien has been doing a lot of work with the Global Change Institute on reaching across UQ. I mean, this is not just a QAAFI question. It's not just a UQ question, right? So we're engaged actively with DAF in that area, connections with the Department of the Environment and Science. We are going to be working much more closely with CSIRO in this area into the future. So again, I think watch this space.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, look, we'll close it up there. But again, I encourage when we have these opportunities to ask questions from the floor. Can we get? Can we bring up the slides just to close off the?
Sorry.
Yeah, if you go right to the end, or to the one before that, Mo.
Yep.
Okay, So first of all, just would like to advertise that Mubashwa Alam from Centre of Port Science is going to speak next week. He was intending to speak at the end of last year, but we had some technical issues that I'm sure we've resolved now. And following on from that, I'd like to encourage all staff to think about putting in a expression of interest of talking. As I mentioned this last QAAFI Institute meeting, but we're very open to hearing from people that are enthusiastic about presenting their work. And also like to close and say, I really encourage any feedback about the seminar series. There may be things that you think can be done differently. We're certainly, I think, got a lot of interest in having some hybrid sessions, and as COVID settles down, we might try and get back to those. So I think I'll leave it there, and see you at Mo's talk next week. Thanks for everybody attending. Cheers.